Hey, welcome back to Furthering Christendom. Today we have a good friend and special guest, Kegan Shaw. How you doing, Kegan?
I'm good, thanks, Tyler. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, so Kegan, you've published in American Philosophical Quarterly, Religious Studies, Faith Philosophy, PhD, Edinburgh, PhD in philosophy from Edinburgh, and also an admirer of Whataburger. Is that right? Did I get everything?
Yeah, I guess that's right. I mean, I've only had Whataburger once in my life. It was so long ago that now it's feeling like it almost never happened.
We
But
need to make it happen again.
that's right.
We need to make that happening. It's been far too long since I've seen you as well. COVID time is
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's been
uh,
years, which is too
needs to
long.
end. This needs to end.
Yeah.
Um, all right, yeah. So I have a question for you today. We want to talk about epistemic disjunctivism. For
Right.
our listeners who have never heard of this, what is epistemic disjunctivism?
Yeah, good. So epistemological disjunctivism is a theory of perceptual knowledge, right? So just the ordinary kind of knowledge you glean from just observing things in your surroundings, right? I think it was Tim Crane who said that the view has a name like an eye disease, which is quite true. But for having an ugly name, the view is really quite beautifully simple. So look, how do you know, for example, that there's a computer screen in front of you? Well, disjunctivism says, look, you can see that there's a computer screen in front of you, and you believe that there's a computer in front of you for or on the basis of this reason, right? End of story. That's all there is that needs to be said. Uh, and so if that view sort of looks like it's common sense or not profound, and that's meant to be sort of the key selling point of the view, it's supposed to be utterly common sense. And the thought is that, look, you just sort of lay the view out on the table. And if you can defend it against objections, then it should enjoy a kind of default status, right? So there's two sort of important things to note about that idea, right? That visual perceptual knowledge can be rationally grounded on the fact that one can see that something is the case, right? The first thing to note is that seeing that something is the case is factive, which is to say that you can't see that something is the case unless it actually is the case, right? So I can't see that there's a computer in front of me unless there actually is a computer in front of me. If there weren't a computer in front of me, I could still seem to see a computer, but I couldn't see that there's a computer. So that mental state of seeing that something is the case is much like knowing that something is the case, which is to say that it's factive. You can't see that P unless P is true. So the rational grounds here are factive or infallible grounds, right? You can't have these grounds for perceptual belief unless your belief is true. That's the first important thing to note. And the second important thing to note is that this factive ground is meant to be reflectively accessible to the subject, right? The thought is that, look, for any reason or rational support you might have for a belief, it has to be reflectively accessible. Otherwise, I mean, it would be strange if if it weren't reflectively accessible, then you could believe that P for a reason, even though that reason was like opaque to you or wasn't clear to you that you had that reason at all, right? So I think McDowell says something like this, right? John McDowell says that the fact that one sees that P is something that the subject can know just by the self-consciousness involved in having the experience that one has, right? So you hear people like Duncan Pritchard saying things like, look, here's epistemological disjunctivism. It's the view that sometimes, indeed oftentimes, perceptual knowledge can enjoy rational support that's both factive and reflectively accessible, right?
So it's a paradigmatic, it's as good as it gets sort of theory about perceptual knowledge primarily, though perhaps not exclusively.
Yeah, right. So disjunctivists can disagree about this, but it's not clear that in order to be a disjunctivist, you have to think that all such knowledge enjoys or need enjoy factive grounds like this. At least as Duncan Pritchard defends it, he thinks that at least in the best cases, in the paradigmatic
Right.
cases, it's possible for one's perceptual knowledge to enjoy this factive rational support. But
Right.
I mean, he leaves it open that you might enjoy perceptual knowledge even without such factive grounds.
Right. Right.
Just that it's possible. It can get as good as this is the idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good. It could be as good as this.
Right.
Well, I know Pritchard also applies this in reference to responding to skepticism. Can you take us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so Pritchard thinks you sort of need epistemological disjunctivism to overcome a kind of important underdetermination-based skeptical problem, right? Underdetermination-based skeptical problem, right? So what is that problem? Well, yeah, I mean, consider again your belief that there's a computer in front of you right now, right? So what is your rational support or your rational grounds for believing that? Right? It can seem intuitive or obvious to say that your rational grounds, that you can see that there's a computer in front of you. But that can seem to be weird or unallowed once you begin reflecting on the fact that it could seem to you that you see a computer, even if you don't, say because you were some victim of a radical deception plot, say. So we can imagine, for example, that, right, 10 years ago, someone barged into your room while you were asleep and tranquilized you and hauled you off to a lab and harvested your brain from your skull, sat it in a vat full of nutrients. And these mad neuroscientists are now sort of playing your brain like a keyboard, artificially inducing all these hallucinations of an actual world that isn't there, right? So if that were the case that you were in right now, if that were your situation, it would seem to you that you can see a computer, or it would seem to you that you can see that there's a computer in front of you, but you wouldn't, right? That would be a mere hallucinatory experience. There would be no computer for you to see. So these kinds of thoughts can make it seem like we can't just say without further ado that your rational grounds for believing there's a computer in front of you or that you see that there's a computer, right? It can seem instead that what we should rather say, we should be more cautious. We should say that your rational grounds for believing that there's a computer in front of you is something like, well, it seems to you that you see a computer, right? At least you're having a computer-like experience, right? Where importantly, right, you can be having this computer-like experience even if there were no computer there in front of you, right? So if you buy into this idea, the thought is that, look, your best rational grounds for thinking there's a computer in front of you will rest on whatever inference you can draw from this mere seeming experience, right? Another way of stating this is in terms of the new evil genius thesis, which you hear Pritchard talking a lot about in the book. So the new evil genius idea is that the rational support that you have for your perceptual beliefs right now is no better than the rational support you would have for those beliefs anyway, if you were, say, in one of these radical deception kind of scenarios, if you were a brain in a vat, for example, right? So that's a new genius thesis. That's super popular, right? You'll find both, say, externalists in epistemology and internalists on both sides sort of accepting this idea about rational support for perceptual beliefs. The problem is that if you buy into that idea, you play right into the hands of the radical skeptic. Thanks Duncan Pritchard, right? So, for example, right, now you know that if there's a computer in front of you, right, there actually is a computer in front of you, that entails that you're not, say, a brain floating in a vat of nutrients, only experiencing a computer that isn't there, right? So right now you know that there can be a computer in front of you only if you're not a brain in a vat. Now, if that's the case, given that you know that, it can seem that you have rational support for believing that there's a computer in front of you, only if that rational support favors or prefers the hypothesis that there is a computer in front of you over the hypothesis that it's just a figment of your imagination because you're a brain in a vat. But if the new genius is true, the new genius thesis is true, it's entirely unclear, at least argues Pritchard, how one's rational grounds favor the common sense hypothesis that one is faced with the computer versus the radical skeptical hypothesis that one is merely hallucinating a computer that isn't there because one is a brain in a vat. And if you can't have favoring grounds for the one hypothesis over the other, at least Pritchard argues that we have good reason for thinking that ultimately you can't have rational support for thinking that there's a computer in front of you. In order to have that, you'd have to have rational support that favors the one belief over the other. And on the new genius thesis, we don't have that because it's the rational support is non-factive. It's rational support you could have anyway, even if you were epistemically doomed. Now, how does that matter? Now, what does that connect with disjunctivism, right? Well, disjunctivism just undercuts this argument at the very beginning, right? Disjunctivism just refuses from the outset to agree to this idea that the rational support you have in the good case, when things are going swimmingly and you're not deceived, is no better than the rational support you have in the bad case. After all, disjunctivism says that in the good case, you have reflective access to the fact that you can see that there's a computer in front of you. And since seeing that there's a computer in front of you actually logically entails that you're not merely hallucinating a computer because your brain of that, clearly that rational support does favor the hypothesis that there's a computer in front of you over the hypothesis that there isn't because you're a brain of that, right? So with disjunctivism in hand, we can literally undercut this sort of skeptical problem at the legs, right as it gets started, right? There's just no good reason for thinking that one cannot have rational support for one's perceptual beliefs that favors or prefers those beliefs over known to be incompatible radical skeptical hypotheses.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for the overview of epistemological disjunctivism and kind of its current form in literature. We know that in a lot of your work, you've applied it to religious belief. Maybe we can go ahead and talk about that. Mike, you want to go ahead, and I think you have a question for him in reference to that.
Yeah, well, I know you wrote one of my favorite papers, especially when I was at HBU with Tyler thinking through these ideas, was your religious epistemological disjunctivism, 2016 in the International Journal of Philosophy and Religion. And so maybe you could sort of expand on and talk about how you apply this idea of ED to religious epistemology.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so I mean, epistemological disjunctivism is traditionally defended as a thesis about visual perceptual knowledge, right? But it's an interesting question to what extent we can sort of extend this model to think about other cases of knowledge that aren't visual perceptual in nature, right? So actually, I just finished reviewing a new series of essays out on epistemological disjunctivism. And in this book, authors attempt to defend models of epistemological disjunctivism. They try to apply that view to cases of, say, for example, memory-based knowledge, knowledge based on testimony, knowledge of other minds, self-knowledge. Conspicuously absent in this volume actually was any kind of application to the religious case, which is sort of some of my research has sort of been involved in, right? So let's shift for a second from thinking about perceptual knowledge, right? So knowledge based on visual experience, to the possibility of something like religious perceptual knowledge. So knowledge that's the direct upshot of a religious experience, for example, right? So for example, let's imagine Stuart, who's super devout, right? We can imagine that Stuart is encountering a certain temptation in his life, and sadly, he gives in to the temptation, right? Now, it wouldn't be unusual to think that after succumbing to temptation, Stuart, this religiously devout person, could come to know something like, God is admonishing me right now for this wrongdoing, right? Couldn't come to know that God is admonishing him at that moment on the basis of a kind of experience to this effect, right? These religious perceptual beliefs I have in mind are what William Alston calls manifestation beliefs, right? In his book, Perceiving God, right? So a manifestation belief is just any belief to the effect that God has some perceivable property or is engaging in some perceivable activity with respect to a subject, right? So in cases like this, right, where a subject might come to believe a proposition about God's activity on the basis of a kind of religious experience, how should we conceive of the rational support that one has for these manifestation beliefs in these cases, right? If we apply a lot of sort of traditional thinking to this case, and this is something I think William Alston might have thought as well. Look, we should say that the best rational support you have in those cases is rational support that's based on, say, you're seeming to perceive God's admonishment or something like that, right? And there you're citing a mental state that you might have anyway, even if you are now subject to some kind of religious delusion in a godless world, right? So in other words, the rational support here is something that's conceived to be neutral between the good and bad cases, right? But if we can defend epistemological disjunctivism in the case of visual perceptual knowledge, I say, why not think about or try to conceive of religious knowledge in this kind of disjunctivist way, right? If we do, it's not clear why we can't say that, look, in these cases, what is going on is that the subject comes to know that God is admonishing them on the basis of perceiving that God is admonishing them, right? Where, of course, perceiving that P is conceived to entail that P, right? You can't perceive that something is the case unless it is the case, right? Just as you can't visually see that something is the case unless that thing actually is the case, right? So we can kind of, I don't see why we can't articulate a view of religious perceptual knowledge that looks something like this, right? In paradigmatic, or the very best cases, one can have religious perceptual knowledge on the basis of reasons that are both factive and reflectively accessible, just as we might say in the case of visual perceptual knowledge. Right? So that's sort of the view roughly articulated.
Yeah, that's excellent, Kegan. I'm going to link the article, the essay, because it's just fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners can gather why this would be an important model, but just to make it explicit, sort of, what are some of the advantages of this model, and why would a religious believer, a Christian, want to endorse such a thing?
Yeah, well, there's a few things you might say here. I mean, arguably, a view like that would inherit all the advantages that, or at least many of the advantages that are claimed for epistemological disjunctivism about visual perceptual knowledge, right? So Pritchard argues that it basically represents a nice marriage or rapprochement between externalist and internalist intuitions about knowledge, right? So if this is true about religious knowledge, we have a case of religious knowledge in which one's epistemic support is not only factive, and so we have a really tight truth connection between one's epistemic support and the belief in question, but it's also reflectively accessible, and so we sort of secure what internalists think is an important sort of element of knowledge, which is a kind of responsibility or accountability about what one believes, right? One should have good reasons in view for believing what one does. Otherwise, why are you believing what you do is sort of the intuitive initial thought, right? But you can also, I think, argue that if you adopt this view, kind of a religious epistemological disjunctivism, you can overcome skeptical problems that you might create that parallel the kinds of skeptical problems that creep up in the visual perceptual case, right? So, I mean, you can imagine, say, the theist on the street, right? So you can imagine someone who isn't a philosopher, hasn't really taken any philosophy or apologetics classes, isn't super aware of or competent with any of the proofs for thinking that God exists, right? The classical proofs, such as the teleological or ontological or moral arguments for God's existence, for example. This person is just extremely devout, but they have no proofs or potentially convincing arguments for God. They just they're faithful in pursuit of the scripture, and they're very much involved in their religious community, but that's about it. So we can imagine a person like this having all kinds of religious experiences from time to time. And the question is, we would like, I think ideally in a religious epistemology, we'd like to make sense of how manifestation beliefs, so beliefs formed on the basis of these religious experiences, could be rationally grounded or supported in a robust fashion, right? The problem is that if we think that one's rational support for these manifestation beliefs is something as paltry and as poor as it's merely seeming to one that one is having an experience of God, something that one could have anyway, even if all the religious skeptics were correct, that religious experiences are mere delusions of nothing in a godless universe, for example, then if you're a religious subject who understands that you can be perceiving God's admonishing you in a given situation only if it's false that you're in some godless universe and this is only a delusion. Right? If you're someone who understands that, then it can seem like your rational support now doesn't favor your belief that God is admonishing you versus the hypothesis that God is not admonishing you because this is a religious delusion in a godless universe, right? If your best reasons are something like whatever inference or argument you can fashion from items that are reflectively accessible, where those are limited to mere seeming experiences, then it's hard to see how those experiences prefer the one hypothesis over the other. And so religious perceptual knowledge can look less than robustly rationally grounded in this way. In the same way, the same thing can be said about visual perceptual knowledge, right? We already said that. But if we adopt the religious epistemological disjunctivist view, then we can hold that actually these religious perceivers have reflectively accessible factive grounds for their beliefs, in which case these grounds actually do favor the belief that God is admonishing them on a given occasion versus the known to be inconsistent skeptical hypothesis that one is not experiencing anything to do with God because it's an illusion and et cetera, right? And so here rational grounds can clearly favor the one over the other. After all, one's rational grounds on this view actually entail that God is admonishing them on a given occasion, right? So they clearly do favor that hypothesis over the hypothesis that God is not doing this. So that's at least one benefit. I mean, this is not something that I've written in that paper, but it's something I've been thinking about a little bit recently in terms of a benefit of being a religious epistemological disjunctivist. There's another benefit that I've argued for in a more recent publication in Faith and Philosophy. So in that paper, I've argued that, and this is the last thing I'll say unless you want more. In that paper, I've argued that, look, if we adopt a religious epistemological disjunctivism, if we adopt this model, I think we can make sense of it's being perfectly legitimate for a religious person to reason in this way to the existence of God, right? Look, God is admonishing me right now for some wrongdoing, therefore God exists, right? Or I'm experiencing the overwhelming power or love of God in my life right now, or I'm experiencing the encouragement of God right now through this trial, therefore God exists, right? A lot of people would be tempted to say there's something circular, something viciously circular, inappropriate about reasoning in that way. And there are a number of ways you might argue for that. There's one important way that you might argue for that I think is undercut if you adopt religious epistemological disjunctivism. And I argue for that in this paper, A Plea for the Theist in the Street. Yeah.
What do you remind me? These seemings that are factive, I think you have your own name for them. What do you call them?
I think I called them numings in the 2016 paper.
Yeah, right.
I said explicitly that I didn't like that term, and I still don't like that term, and so I don't really use it because I think it's, I don't know. I mean, it's like PNEUM, right. So it's meant to be like spirit-induced religious experience.
Right.
Yeah, in the paper, I'm just hunting for some name that we might substitute for seeing that something is the case, because clearly you don't visually see
right.
anything that God is. Well, yeah, that's the wrong sort of word to use in the religious experiential case. But yeah, in that paper, I called them numing that P, right, or instead of seeing that P. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in my elements volume, I made sure to include that. I like it.
Okay, good. Yeah, excellent. Great. Let's let that catch fire.
Yeah, no, it's been great having you on and going through everything with us. Tell us a little bit real quick before you go. What are you working on now? What sort of project or projects can we look forward to you producing in the future?
Yeah, right. So I'm continuing to work a little bit on this religious epistemological disjunctivism stuff. And so I talked a little bit about just now about the kinds of things that I'm thinking about, what kinds of radical skeptical arguments we might be able to overcome by adopting a religious epistemological disjunctivist model. So there's that. I'm working on some ideas, working on making clear or grappling with some ideas we find in John Henry Newman. So Newman says some weird things like that, look, what the church accepts today in her creeds is something the church has always held forever, say since the beginning, right? And he says things that, look, clearly clearly the church didn't explicitly believe these things since the beginning, because that took time to be worked out and such. But he says that it might still be possible to think that the church held, in some sense, held to these ideas, if just as sort of religious impressions. He uses this word a lot. And so I wonder what he thinks a religious impression is. And I wonder if we can bring to bear certain recent work in the metaphysics of visual experience to make sense of a metaphysics of religious experience that could actually bear that out. So I'm working a little bit on that as well at the moment.
That's really good. Really interesting stuff. And to the former of these, don't you like owe a paper in the near future, in a few months to
Yes, that's right.
to me?
That's right. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So I owe Tyler and company a paper and contribution to this handbook on religious epistemology that they're doing.
Looking forward to reading that.
That's right. Yeah. So part of some of this stuff that I'm thinking about in terms of skepticism and religious epistemology disjunctivism will appear, I think, in that paper.
Wonderful.
But yeah, also working on that for sure.
Well, thanks so much for coming on, and hopefully maybe in the near future we can have you back on again.
Yeah, certainly.
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you, Kegan. Appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Mike. Good chatting with you guys.
Awesome having you on.